Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing a little book mapping with the tarot. This is an activity I mentioned in a recent video where I ran through 5 tarot exercises and how one might use the cards a little bit more consciously, using them face up as opposed to randomly flipping them over for purposes of divination. Book mapping is a way that I better understand and internalize and critically think about a book after I finished it. So I recently finished a novel I really enjoyed and was going to go about that process, but I thought I would film it and share it and take you all through it as I do it, so that way you might get a better understanding of how I go about book mapping. And if you are looking to try it, this might be a little bit helpful. I'll try to go through various things that might arise, ways that you might go about it, so it's not going to be exactly specific to this book, at least, well, the actual outcome will be, but I'll run through how you might do it for any other book as well, and what differences may arise or be the case for you if you're reading a different type of book. So we're going to get over to a table in just a second where we are going to begin mapping it. The book that I am going to be doing this activity with is Wild Seed by Octavia Butler. I just recently mentioned this in my wrap-up video for September. It's a novel, I really enjoyed it, and I would like to think a little bit more on it, hopefully retain some of what I read, and that way it can benefit me. I can go forward with these themes and elements and the best parts of the literature, and they can enhance my life and experience, and that's what this is all about. So we're going to head over to the table. I'm using the Thoth deck, and I will let you know how I go about mapping the book and what sorts of things I keep in mind and how I use the cards in this way. So we're going to go over there right now and get right into it. Alright everybody, so we're over at my table. We're going to begin mapping Octavia Butler's Wild Seed. Just a warning, there may be some spoilers, so if you're looking to read this book, I'm giving you the warning now, but I don't think I'm going to try to avoid very particular details and the minutiae of the book, but there are going to be some themes spoken about and larger events alluded to, so keep that in mind. If you're looking to read this and you don't like spoilers, maybe return to this afterwards and it can be a recap for you in a way. So I, of course, like to have a notebook or paper and something to write with when I'm doing this. It's nice to write down my findings so they don't just wash away with the tides. There's some sort of concrete, physical way for me to reflect and to return to what it was that I was thinking when I mapped this out. So that's really important for me. Sometimes I actually begin by mapping it in the notebook, but there are other times where I'll do the whole spread, or I'll do a portion of the mapping and then I'll record my findings or what I've done within the notebook. And then I like to, of course, have a sort of takeaway and the various things that I saw within my mapping that either surprised me or just elements of the novel that came out that I was thinking about during the mapping process. So book mapping with the tarot for me is a conscious exercise where I'm going through the cards face up and choosing cards to represent either themes, lessons learned, characters, motifs, the narrative and plot line and various points. And so there are some ways that I am trying to very literally depict the book in a visual way, and there are others where I'm getting a little bit more abstract and trying to map out themes and undercurrents within the literature. Now, I think that this exercise is great for books that follow a narrative path or are just very story-driven. So novels, memoirs, even biographies might be great. Any sort of story-driven literature. Books that are more instructional and educational, that don't have themes and characters and plot and world building of any sort, those are going to be harder to do this exercise with, and I don't think you're going to gain as much. So just keep that in mind. But if there's a story, if there are characters, if there's anything like that, you could probably do this exercise with the cards and get something from it. So I'm actually going to end up recording afterwards, just because it would be a lot to film me visually mapping and writing down things here. So This will just keep this in mind, and while you're doing it, think to yourself that maybe you might want to start with the writing process and to write out what you're looking to get out of this. You might look and start to sketch out what you might put down on the table and the way and the structuring you want. So keep that all in mind, or you might be somebody who just wants to record it after. So I do have in mind how I'd like to go about this. For me, this book, Wild Seed, was very much driven by the story was driven by the characters. So some novels, some literature is very much driven by the plot or the themes and the elements that prevail throughout, or there's sort of an underlying undertone of like a message or something like that, or the world building is very detailed and nuanced. So however you want to go about this, but for me, the characters were the big focal point here, and they drove the entirety of the story. The themes, the plot progression, all of it was very much centered around the characters and their voice, their choices, their thoughts, their feelings. So they're going to be the biggest focal points. If you have a piece of literature where the characters feel very much in the background or they don't stand out, and what stood out to you was the progression of events, maybe that's going to be the big focal point. You don't need to have cards to represent the characters necessarily, but I'm going to, because to me they are the focal point of the novels. So we have two main characters, the protagonist Anyanwu and the antagonist Doro. Anyanwu I'm going to pick 2 cards for, the same for Doro, 1 card to represent her when where she starts and 1 where she ends, where the book ends. And so this is going to depict her character arc and her progression and let us know that she started somewhere and ended up somewhere else. And that visual representation is going to be important for me to understand her better as a very multifaceted and complex human being, or in the case of this novel, more of a superhuman being in a way. And then the same for Doro, 1 card for him at the beginning of the story and 1 for him at the end to give us not black and white, but create a sort of a dichotomy between the beginning and ending of the narrative. So Anyanwu started out, she was very pure and good and a bit naive, but her intentions were there. She was ferocious. She was almost this raw, uncut or unrefined gem in a way, in a very beautiful way. And so I'm going to pick something that's very natural and wild and connected to the earth and kind and beautiful to symbolize her in the start, and that is going to be the Princess of Discs. I think is very representative of Anyanwu at the beginning. She's at the start. In the Thoth Tarot, the Princess of Discs is very much the earth of earth. She is the youngest. She's almost like the end of the cycle, but the beginning of a new. And to me, she represents this sort of purity and innocence of nature, of being, of existence. And so I'm going to use her to represent Anyanwu at the start of the narrative. And then come the end, she has a sort of wisdom. There's almost this jaded quality to her. She is full-fledged. She is this very well-rounded and encapsulated healer of a sort. She is a justice warrior in a way, and she knows herself and others to a great degree. There's almost nothing that can stop her at this point other than herself. And so for Anyanwu at the end of the narrative, I'm going to use the World card. And I think that the World card is very representative of her as she has become by the end. There's pretty much nothing in the world other than her that can stop her. She has done so much, seen so much. She has lived so many lifetimes. She is, in essence, immortal, and the only one that can kill her really is Doro. Doro also being immortal. They're the only 2 immortal beings on Earth, and while Doro is invincible and immortal, Anyanwu is almost invincible and immortal. And so it is this big give and take, tug and pull between Doro and Anyanwu throughout the novel. And by the end, it's almost like Anyanwu has gotten the upper hand for the first time on Doro. And it's like everything has come full circle. And so the world is perfect for representing her at the end. Next, we're going to pick the cards for Doro. In the beginning, he is quite cold and calculating. He's very much that dastardly villain. He's a bit of a charmer, but he's quite murderous. He doesn't have much humanity very present within him that we can see. And he's manipulative and calculated, very driven by the material world, empirical knowledge, and his own means that he hopes to achieve through less than savory actions. So to represent Doro at the beginning, I'm actually going to pick the Hierophant. And the reason for this is more so the darker aspect of the Hierophant. He thinks he knows everything. He thinks he has the world in his pocket. He thinks that he is divinity and that he is a god. He thinks that he knows all and that he has this wisdom to impart and that everybody else is his subject and that he is many levels above anybody else who might exist and that they are there for him to use, to play with, to help him along in his life and to make him more comfortable. And so the darker aspect of the Hierophant here, I think, is very much representative of Doro. We also see these masks present, and Doro actually is sort of a spirit that inhabits others' bodies. So when he dies, he goes to another body, and once he's within that body, the person dies. So when he leaves, the person doesn't come back, they're dead. And so in a way, he's constantly wearing masks. We never see just Doro for who he is. He's never just him. And there are a bunch of masks in this card, and it reminds me of the fact that very much so throughout the entire narrative, every facet of Doro and every representation we see of him is really just a mask. Next, we are going to use a card to represent Doro at the end, and this is when he's been broken down. He's been beaten, battered, and faced a lot because of Anyanwu, and been forced to almost see the light of day, to come to his humanity, and it's almost only when she threatens ending her own life, threatening to end her immortal existence, that he is confronted with his own mortality, his, I would say, figurative mortality, and that he is a human, and that he does interact with this world, and that there is beauty, and that he is not greater than anybody else. And so in a way, he is very much the Ten of Swords, ruin. To me, this is a card of surrender, of shattering, of being brought to your knees. And so that is really where Doro's at the end. And I think it's necessary for him to be completely broken down so that he might be built back up in a better image and want more for himself and to be a better person. And so he is actually, it seems like a downgrade, but it's very much an upgrade, and I think it's a necessary point for him to have arrived at. So those are going to be the cards symbolizing the main characters, and I think those are very important. So next what I want to do is map out the actual narrative. So the various themes, the points that happened, the big events, and what took place, and to look at what that might look like in a line. So I'll move these cards up just a bit. Now I'm going to go through and select the cards. The book was actually broken into 3 very distinct sections. So one took place in, I believe, the 1600s in Africa during the slave trade, and then there was, within that same section, the journey to the US where Anyanwu was manipulated by Doro and taken to the United States, to the colonies. So that's one big section of the book. The next middle section jumps forward about 50 or so years, and that's at a Dutch colony in the north, I believe, in what would be modern-day New York. And so that's a big chunk of the novel as well. And then the final portion and chunk of the novel skips forward a little over 100 years, and it's right around leading up to the Civil War, and it's on a plantation where Anyanwu has used her ability to shapeshift so that she might acquire a plantation and take in those who are in need. So that's the end portion. So I'm going to keep that in mind as I map out this narrative, and I'm going to pick out the cards I think that suit the progression best, and then take you all through why I chose those cards and what they signify in terms of a narrative. Okay, as I'm here selecting these cards, I was really just planning on coming back at the end and showing you how they worked out, but I guess this part of the process is valuable. So what I'm doing actually is going through the cards face up, and I'm creating 2 piles. One pile that just speaks to me and says this card probably belongs to some part of the narrative, and one where when I look at the card I don't feel very drawn to it being connected to the narrative. So right now, any card that I look at and think this fits within the storyline, this is very applicable, I put in one pile. And that's not to say I'm going to use all of them, but there are some cards that I want to weed out that I know are very much, I don't think, very connected to the novel, to the narrative, as far as I'm concerned, and what I feel and what I think about what has taken place. So that might be a helpful way to go about it, is to just start going through and just making a pile of every card you think might be incorporated and to get rid of the ones that you don't feel drawn to, and make it a very swift process. Don't overthink it. If you feel like, you know what, this isn't working, I don't think this is in, no, this isn't there, yeah, maybe, and so you put it in the pile. And that's how I go about it. And then I take the ones that are contenders for being part of the narrative and I start to actually place them down in a chronological, very linear fashion, at least if I'm mapping the narrative and the plot points in terms of the chronology of the story. All right, so we have the plot line. I was going to lay it out and take you through them, but there are too many to fit on the table in a view that is, yeah, I can't fit them all. So we're gonna just take it through and I'm going to lay them down and let you know. Now, the best part about this is that not every event in the novel holds the same amount of weight. I might skip a few things, or I might put a lot of cards to one event, and I might feel like one event was very pivotal, or one chapter deserves maybe one small section of the book has 5 cards, and a gigantic chapter or set of chapters at the end might only have 2 or 3 because to me they were fluff or they didn't stand out. And so this is not going to be representative of the book in a very measured way that is accurate and weighted in terms of the length of the book. This is very much just how I saw the narrative to progress. So keep that in mind, and when you're doing this, you might have a bunch of cards piled up at the beginning, but maybe that was really important for you, and you see a sudden shift, and there's a lot of cards missing that you don't feel called to add anything toward where the middle of the book was, but you have a lot bunched up at the end as well, and maybe that's telling of what you thought and what the style of the story was. So don't feel like it needs to be very evenly spaced given the pages of the book and all of that. So first, I'll start with the Lust card, which for me was Anyanwu at the very beginning before she met Doro. She was free, she had no limits, she was living her life, well, her immortal life, and having a good time. There was nothing really too pressing. She just continued to live her life, to heal, to be, to exist, and she enjoyed it. And so to me, this is the perfect card to represent her at this time. It's very much, to me, this is Anyanwu right here. She's got the sun in her hands, and actually we are told that Anyanwu means sun woman, it translates to. And so for her to be holding this, I feel like she's at her most pure at the beginning and the events that take place there. So this is her then. Next, we have the Knight of Swords, which to me is Doro sweeping in. He's disruptive, he's impulsive, he arrives very quickly and swoops her up. And there's something about him that is very heady. In a way, he's a spirit, so the quickness is there. He can travel very quickly. He isn't held by any laws of the world, the tangible, and so this is Doro as a disruptive force. Next, we see the Lovers, and this to me is the choice and the union of Doro and Anyanwu at the beginning when they're first getting acquainted, and there is a stage where he's infatuated with her and she's intrigued by him, and she does feel called to go with him and follow him, but she also knows she's being manipulated and that this is a calculated choice to be made. And so the Gemini aspect of the Lovers and the choice and the union seems perfect for the beginning stages of their courtship in a way, or their relationship. Next, we have Pleasure, which is the happier aspects toward the beginning as they're progressing across the land. She knows she's going to get on a ship and go somewhere or to leave. But for me in the Thoth, the Six of Cups, you can see little snakes inside these cups. And so there's something a bit, to me, nefarious about that, something hidden in this beauty. And Anyanwu seems very much aware of the fact, her intuition tells her that not all the glitter is gold, that there's going to be something to it, and that she needs to plan properly, and her emotions are really roiling and toiling. So this is their beginning travels across the land and her having to leave what is known. And there's an element of pleasure, but there's also something seedy about it, and she knows it. Next is the Princess of Swords, and this is very much Anyanwu as the challenger, as the warrior, when she is willing to always speak up to Doro, speak against him, and to fight. But it's very calculated, and she knows how far she can push what she's got. She knows what she has in her favor, and that he doesn't want to kill her, that he wants to use her, and that she is valuable to him, but that she doesn't necessarily hold the power because he can kill her and she cannot kill him. And he can also manipulate her in terms of her children, her family, and others around her. So she, to me, reminds me very much of the silver-tongued warrior that is the Princess of Swords. And this is a prevailing theme. So while this very much comes to a head at the point when they kind of get on the boat, and we're very much aware of the fact that she is always going to be willing to rebel, to speak out, to try, to fight, this is really when we start to become acquainted with that side of her. Next, we have Oppression, and this is a very sad card, actually. This is when Anyanwu gets on the ship. It is a slave ship, and we are confronted with an area where slave trade is taking place, and it's wrought with oppression and sadness, and just the worst of humanity comes out in terms of those who are enslaving the people and what they're doing to them, and it's awful. And in a way, Anyanwu is a slave, and while she is given more liberties and freedoms, she is still on a slave ship being taken from her homeland to a colony, and it's against her will to some extent, although she tries to think of it in different terms and allows herself a sort of mental and emotional and spiritual freedom. She is oppressed, and so the ship and the scenes that take place on it very much highlight the ideas present in the Ten of Wands and the oppression here. Next, we have Power, and this is very much Doro's power and how we become acquainted with it as we get to know the people he has under his influence, his children, his colonies that he has, that he owns, where he has a sort of like eugenics experiment going on, where he wants to breed people to have abilities, to be better, to be superhuman, to hopefully be immortal, but he does so through really, really horrible means. And although he treats them in some ways decently, in other ways, the fact that they just are there against their will and they don't get to choose who they marry, who they're partnered with, and sometimes he kills them and punishes them and uses them. To me, this Four of Discs is very much where we start to see Doro's power in terms of people and like civilizations that he's constructed, and learning more about how he operates. Next is Dominion, and this is when we get to the main settlement, the Dutch colony in the north, and this is where we start to see Doro really flex his power, and a lot of the darker aspects of him come out, where he is killing and manipulating and using, and Anyanwu is watching all of it go on around her and trying to help, and also trying to fight back and just stay alive and figure out what the next big move is going to be. And so this to me feels like Doro's forcefulness trying to break her in a way. I'm going to just move these cards aside so that we have room for more. Now, next we have the card of Strife, and to me this is a pivotal point when Doro tells Anyanwu that she is no longer his wife and that she's going to marry his son, which to her is blasphemous and an abomination, as she says it. She doesn't want to marry the son of her husband and leave her husband, even though he's horrible. And so this is a big breaking point where she changes, she fights back, and he almost kills her here actually, but the son of Doro, who is actually a very good man, stops him, and Anyanwu grows to love him very dearly, and arguably he is the best person in her life throughout the novel. They spend his whole life together, although she won't die. It's the progression of his life, and she learns a lot about what it means to be human and how she is able to operate even amidst this oppression, because of course, although Doro loves his son, who he's forcing her to marry, he does keep the son in his tight grips and forces him to marry Anyanwu as well and to live on this settlement. And so to me, this is a point of friction that helps Anyanwu to see more clearly and to grow and to become enlivened and impassioned by her situation and to fight more. Next, we have Debauch, and this is the Seven of Cups. And for me, this is a pivotal point when Anyanwu is confronted with an even lower aspect of Doro, where she finds and enters a period where she sees him to be irredeemable. Up until this point, she thought she might be able to help him. She was willing to concede on some things, but after what takes place at this point in the narrative, she hates him very openly in a way where she doesn't almost care if he kills her. And I've chosen this card because to me this is a card of, in a way, emotional, just it feels icky. To me, this actually symbolizes in some ways alcoholism, and we see that she's forced to, as a punishment, to marry and have children, or just to have children with this man who is racist and violent and abusive and sickly, and she takes the time to heal him and to educate him, and he actually makes a big turnaround, and Doro visits only to realize that it wasn't much of a punishment, that she enjoyed healing this man and that now she has feelings for this man, and so he punishes her by killing the man, taking his body, and forcing her, threatening to kill her, and then forcing her to bury this man. And it's awful, it's sickening. Actually, her time with this man before he is changed, while he is very violent and ignorant, is actually quite awful. And so to me, this represents that portion. Next is cruelty, and this is the time period taking place at the end of this portion going forward, where Doro is particularly cruel to Anyanwu. He makes it clear that he's actually planning on killing her once his one son dies, and he's only allowing her to live out of respect for him. And she very openly hates Doro, and he inflicts quite a bit of cruelty upon her, so that is very indicative of this point in the novel. Next, we have Fortune, and this is where we see a big change. To me, this is a turning point in the way things are constructed in the narrative, in the plot. And this is when, at the funeral of the son who was Anyanwu's husband, she transforms into an animal and she flees the settlement. And that is one of the few areas where she can get the upper hand on Doro. He can't kill her when she's an animal, and also it's impossible for him to sense her and track her. So she, for many years, fluctuates between being a human and an animal just to be free and to not have to deal with Doro. And that takes place for a few hundred years, and it makes it very hard for him to track her. So this is a big turning point, and this is where she learns a lot about herself, and also where she comes to own the plantation and take in others who are in need and really come into her own as a healer and somebody who is a warrior for justice and change. And so that's part of her journey. And here is Doro's obstacles in trying to find Anyanwu, and also her having to overcome these hurdles inside of herself and what she's faced in order to create a new life and to start anew and to create a family around herself of like-minded people who need her help. And on the plantation, she comes into the role of mother and empress. She has many children. She takes in others and is very much symbolically their mother. And she is a healer, somebody who is constantly trying to help and fix and create a better world and a society around herself. And she's protective, very fiercely so. And during that time, I feel she's actually quite genuinely happy. And so to me, this is a relief point for her, a time when she can be and set down some roots and really embody who it is that she wants to be. So then we come to futility with Aquarius, where, and the Seven of Swords, of course, and this is where Doro finds her. And he arrives, and it's almost, there's this surrendering there where Anyanwu knew he would eventually find her, and that in her settling and being human for long enough, he would be able to track her. So she has this resigned sort of surrendering aspect to her, where she accepts what will come, but at the same time wants to protect her people. Doro is also coming to a point where he's surrendering to the fact that he thinks he's going to let her live, and that her actions and who she is just who she is, and that he has to come to terms with that as well. Then we see the Queen of Discs, and this is where we see Anyanwu really taking control of her kingdom and fighting back against Doro, knowing that he doesn't intend to kill her, that the time that he had away from her caused perspective and he started to change a little bit. There was a crack in his cruel and vile armor, and he has a soft spot for her, so she's able to hold sway and make more change. And so she can force him or coerce him, or at least appeal to his humanity a bit in terms of keeping people alive and not manipulating them so much. And she tries to mitigate the downfall and the cruelty that he inflicts. And so in that way, there's a truce where he starts to recognize her as an equal, and it's the first step he takes in recognizing anybody as his equal, and that his sort of ego complex where he views himself as a god who is above all starts to decay a little bit. And so the first big step for him is to view Anyanwu as an equal, and then in turn it makes it possible for him to see others as human and to find value in them that is more than just what they can provide for him. Sorry, the air conditioner kicked on. Then we come to Sorrow. Now we've reached the end point of the novel, and this is when Anyanwu realizes that there are limits to how much Doro can change, that he is always going to have to kill, and that thousands of years of living and taking advantage of others is very hard to break. And so she starts to give up and feel hopeless and shattered. And this is where she starts to contemplate suicide. So she's fiercely trying to survive throughout the book, and just when he starts to feel like he sees her as an equal and might let her live, she starts to see that there's still so much bad in him, and that the idea of facing an eternity with him makes her want to not live any longer. And so this is that point where she's grappling with the idea of ending her own life. And then we have the tower where there's a breakdown, and this is where Doro shatters actually and begs and cries for the first time in what we are told is hundreds of years or generations, and he concedes to many of the requests that she makes, and a lot of his outer veneer is just sloughed off, and he is left naked and bare like a child. And we see that there is humanity within him, and that he might be capable of change and creating and inciting some good in the world after having done so much harm and inflicting so much pain. And so this is when Doro actually shatters, and in a way Anyanwu shatters, and she comes to this state where she realizes that they are inextricably bound for better or worse. As much as she might hate him, she's the only one who can change him, and so she feels like she has a responsibility to live and to be there for him. And at this point, throughout the last little bit, she doesn't exactly hate and abhor him, but she doesn't like him either. She likes him for what he can do and what he's capable of in terms of good, but when he does bad, she's very quick to fight back against him. And finally, we have the Judgment card, or the Aeon, and this is where I see a new chapter to open. We end the book just being told that in the morning Anyanwu is alive, that she chose not to kill herself, that she still has a heartbeat, and then the plot closes, the story ends. And so to me, it felt like stepping through a portal, that there was so much to happen, so much change to come, and that hopefully Doro would stop killing, would stop enslaving and manipulating, and that he would hopefully take some pages from Anyanwu's book and hopefully work for something better going forward. And so to me, it felt like this trial by fire where all of the things that we hated within him kind of burned up, and that they now have a chance at rebirth. And so you can see this was it, that this was very much driven by the characters. I didn't mention too much in terms of actual events where things happened that were outside of the characters. I didn't mention many of the secondary characters, and it's really because we are hearing the thoughts and the dialogue of Anyanwu and Doro, and they have very strong personalities, and so the story is really the story of them, and in that way the narrative followed them. And so that's how I would have mapped this book, and of course I would write down each card I chose and why, and the elements that it tied to within the narrative. So I hope that this was helpful for anybody watching. I'd love to know if you like to map books and to work consciously with the cards to better understand your readings, and what books you've maybe done this exercise with, and if you followed along. Now, I hope you are all well. Like and subscribe if this was fun and helpful and interesting, and until next time, bye.